beloved brothers and sisters in the Abrahamic covenant. The subject we have to consider this afternoon, the first of the three great earthquakes of the book of the Apocalypse. There were only three great earthquakes. There was another earthquake mentioned, but it was not considered a great earthquake for reasons which unfortunately we don't have time to go into. And before I commence, I suppose I ought to say three things. The first is that Brother Dan gave us a sort of demonstration this morning of how David cut Goliath's head off. I don't propose to do anything to replicate an earthquake or anything like that, which would be not a good idea. The second thing is that we really don't have time to go into any of the history in depth, which is probably just as well, because much of the history would be meaningless to an extent. We're looking rather at the spiritual side of things, the bearing that the Apocalypse has on us, and what we understand in the book of the Apocalypse. And we really, unfortunately, don't have that much time to go into a verse by verse, which would be nice. And it was very difficult preparing these addresses, knowing that we just read about the Apocalypse chapter 6. It would be nice to consider all of the seals, but we just don't have time this afternoon. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. Apocalypse chapter 6, verse 12. The whole series this weekend of earthquakes couldn't be more topical in many ways. Before the subject had been chosen, we had the backdrop of the earthquake in New Zealand, and after the subject was chosen, we had the earthquake in Japan, and of course there's been another earthquake since in New Zealand. And I think anyone who's seen any pictures or any sort of news clips of these events will realise that the effects of earthquakes are absolutely devastating. I think one person in New Zealand said it's the most horrible feeling when the earth is shaking under your feet. It's almost like your last friend has deserted you. Everything's falling around you, that's one thing, but to feel the earth shaking under your feet is horrific. And really, keeping those sort of thoughts in mind may help us understand the enormity of the earthquakes that we are to look at this weekend. The whole series really revolves around the conflict that began in Genesis chapter 3. That conflict, of course, was as a result of Adam and Eve's sin. And it was predicted that there would be enmity between the woman's seed and the serpent. The earthquakes that we consider in the book of the Apocalypse is but a continuation of that, and an augmentation of that, really, in the extent of the conflicts in the Roman world. Before we look at the earthquakes, let's read together Apocalypse chapter 5, verse 1, because really, some of these, it's pointless looking at these historical events and not really coming away with anything beneficial. Apocalypse chapter 5, verse 1 says, "And I saw on the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book, written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, Who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof? And no man in heaven nor in earth, neither under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. And I wept much, because no man was found worthy to open and to read the book, neither to look thereon. And one of the elders saith unto me, Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, hath prevailed to open the book, and to loose the 7 seals thereof." So we have this book, which is, in essence, the book of the Apocalypse, really, that was sealed. It was unintelligible. To the world outside, they couldn't care less. The book is sealed, so what? But to John, the faithful servant, he wept. Because he wanted to understand. He wanted to know what was in the purpose of the deity. So John wept. And obviously John was the recipient of the interpretation. He was told to weep not, because the Lion of the tribe of Judah has opened the book. And he turned round and he saw a lamb. He didn't see a lion, he didn't see something ferocious. It was called, the title was the Lion of the tribe of Judah, but he saw a lamb. It was Christ in his sacrificial or subservient phase, not in his phase of judgment. This is the position of the saints in the whole 2,000-year history of the apocalypse. Subservient, not vicious, not fighting. They have been persecuted and prevailed against by the powers that be. So we, brothers and sisters, before we think about anything else, must go away and remember that without that same anxiety to understand, without that same burning ambition to understand the things of God's holy oracles, we will not be blessed to execute the judgments written. Now, with relation to these upheavals, let me pause there a second, because they're called earthquakes. Now, as we know, the Apocalypse chapter 1 says that God sent and signified these things to John. In other words, they were signs, they were symbols. So we aren't to look at everything in the book of the Apocalypse and interpret them literally. We have to interpret them symbolically, of course. The world, so first of all then, the earthquakes are not literal earthquakes. We see I'm no seismologist, but it's not particularly difficult to conceive how earthquakes work. You have these tectonic plates which slide together, and you get these locking points which friction and a vast amount of energy builds up. And at some point, whatever the trigger might be, breaking point is reached, and that vast amount of energy is released, and obviously causes horrendous damage depending on the power of the earthquake. This is what we may term subterranean earthquakes or literal earthquakes. Now, the earthquakes of the apocalypse are political, not subterranean. Now, we may see in the last great earthquake, which we'll have a look at Sunday, God willing, that there will be literal earthquakes. But Brother Thomas says that the earthquakes in the book of the Apocalypse are political or popular. In other words, they relate to the people and the governments. They don't produce any less suffering for all that. Just because the earth isn't literally shaken under their feet did not literally mean that any less blood was shed. But the point is that everything that was then done, the government and the system of society went through a time of massive upheaval. In all three great earthquakes, two are past, of course, and the one is yet future, and the whole scene has changed. The world looks at these events and debates over them as to their good or bad. We, as enlightened holders of truth, look back and see them as Yahweh's artillery. We look back at these things as milestones in God's plan and purpose, gradually unfolding this huge drama whereby eventually the kingdoms of men will all subside and be overtaken by God's great kingdom. So verse 12 then of Apocalypse chapter 6, I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island removed out of their places. Two things are evident here. One, we've already alluded to the fact that this was an enormous upheaval. Whatever it is describing, it's completely and utterly changed the scene. It's wreaked havoc in its path, and nothing remains the same. And the second thing, which you've already mentioned, is that it's symbolic. For example, earthquakes, as far as I'm aware, never affected the stars of heaven, and certainly not in the way that made them fall to the earth. So we're looking for symbolic interpretation of this. We're not going to have time to really look at the way this falls in the book of the Apocalypse. But if you remember, the book of the Apocalypse is made up of sevens. You have the letters to the seven ecclesias, which is the case, if you like, of the book of the Apocalypse. And if you open the case, you'll get the seven seals, and those seven seals were opened. In the sixth seal, we have this great earthquake. After this great earthquake, the seventh seal opens to reveal seven trumpets. The seventh trumpet, of course, opens or sounds, which in its turn unleashes the seven vials. And when the seventh vial is poured out, we have the seven thunders. But that's detail we don't have time to go into. But where we are here is in the sixth seal. Now this great earthquake is one that fulfilled the prophecy of Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. If you turn there in your own time, you'll see him predicting this man of sin, this son of perdition, who would be revealed when there would be a falling away. That falling away, of course, is the Greek word apostasy. But in Paul's time it was prevented. He said that him that letteth will let. Now that letteth is more correctly rendered preventeth. In other words, there was something preventing this man of sin. It was the power of paganism. In AD 312, or in that time period, this vast political upheaval, this great earthquake, shook the pagan constitution of the world, whereby Christianity, so-called, obtained control over the Roman Empire. The world sees this as a victory for Christianity, or at least the Christian world sees it as a victory for Christianity. And the scriptures concur to a degree, but only insofar as it's a witness to Christ. The fact that the worship of Christ, by whatever form that might be, was now established in the Roman Empire, was a testimony to the fact that Christ was a fact. Christ did exist. But the reality is actually very different, because as we know, the Christianity that was established on the seven hills of Rome was not the Christianity inculcated by the apostles. There's always a historical context to these things, is there not? The government that became established in the early 4th century under the guise of Christianity became the most hideous, the most ugly, the most vile, and the most foul system that has been known to man. But its origins are in the truth. And this is the sad fact. So many of the apostasies in times gone as well have had their origins in the truth. Look at the scribes and Pharisees. They eventually crucified the Messiah. And yet they had their origins in the law of Moses, in God's people. It was the same for this 4th century Christianity. They had their origins in the apostolic faith. Let's turn to Zechariah chapter 5 to introduce our remarks on this, because here we have a prophecy revealed even years before Christ. We have in Zechariah chapter 4 that beautiful vision of the golden lampstand being fed by the 2 olive trees. But in chapter 5 we have a change. Chapter 5 verse 3, then said he unto me, this is the curse that goes forth over the face of the whole earth. For everyone that stealeth shall be cut off as on this side according to it, and everyone that sweareth shall be cut off as on that side according to it. I will bring it forth, saith Yahweh Sabaoth, and it shall enter into the house of the thief, and into the house of him that sweareth falsely by my name, and it shall remain in the midst of his house, and shall consume it with the timber thereof and the stones thereof. Then the angel that talked to me went forth, and said unto me, lift up now thine eyes, and see, what is it that goeth forth? And I said, what is it? And he said, this is an ephah that goeth forth. He said, moreover, this is their resemblance throughout all the earth. And behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead, and this is a woman that sitteth in the midst of the ephah. And he said, this is wickedness. And he cast it into the midst of the ephah, and he cast the weight of lead upon the mouth thereof. Then lifted I up mine eyes and looked, and behold, there came out 2 women, and the wind was in their wings. For they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between the earth and the heaven. Then said I to the angel that talked with me, Whither did these bear the ephah? And he said unto me, To build it in an house in the land of Shinar, and it shall be established and set there upon their own base. So this then is a curse that goes forth over the whole earth. It's not just a curse that's localized to the land of Israel. This is a curse that goes forth over the whole earth. And bear in mind, this isn't the whole globe. The earth as it was then was limited to the empire of, well, of course, in the time of Zechariah, it would be Medo-Persia, but it grew with the succeeding Greeks and then the Romans. I have to skip over some details here, but we need to consider the ephah. The ephah represents the measure of wickedness. The wickedness of what? The wickedness of the woman. And what is the woman? The woman is, if you like, in apocalyptic terms, the Jezebel apostasy that was establishing itself in Israel and would continue to grow in the nation of Israel. Wickedness is also often personified by a woman. In verse 9, we read of the ephah and the woman, because the woman is in the ephah, being lifted up. Then lifted I up mine eyes and looked, and behold, there came out two women, and the wind was in their wings, for they had the wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between the earth and the heaven. So we have two women lifting up this Jezebel apostasy of wickedness and carrying it somewhere. Ezekiel 23 verse 4 gives us a clue with regards to Jerusalem and Samaria. And the names of them, he says, were Aholah the elder and Oholibah his sister, and they were mine, and they bare sons and daughters. Thus were their names. Samaria is Aholah, and Jerusalem Oholibah. And Aholah played the harlot when she was mine, and she doted on her lovers, on the Assyrians her neighbours. So the two capitals then, Jerusalem and Samaria, are put forth as representative of the nation of wickedness. They were carried forth. Where to? Verse 11, to the land of Shinar. Now Daniel 1 tells us that Belshazzar carried the people of Israel and all the pertinences of the temple to the land of Shinar. So are we therefore to interpret this verse as literal Babylon? But Babylon was already in steady decline. The Medo-Persians had conquered the city, and the city was well on its way to becoming a desolate habitation. It's not evidently the land of Babylon, and on the grounds that if we interpret that literally, we would have to interpret this woman in the ephah and the wings of a stork, etc. literally, which would be ridiculous. Nevertheless, the link to Babylon is not accidental. Shinar means the land of the enemy's turf. The settlement of Israel's wickedness in another land was in the land of a great enemy. It was an enemy to those of spiritual Israel and an enemy to natural Israel. It was a province of the great iron teeth, as Brother Thomas calls it. The land of the Roman Empire. And the book of the Apocalypse takes up this theme with the predictions of Babylon the Great. This was the province where this land of Shinar and where this apostasy was to be built up for Jezebel, this harlot of Ephah. This would be the area whereby this wickedness would be carried forth. They are those who say they are Jews and are not, but do lie, and are the synagogue of Satan. This is what we are looking for the fulfillment of this. Catholic Rome was the land of the enemy's tooth. It is in this city that the harlot of Ephah settled and became a curse that goeth forth over the whole earth. How did it get there? How did it get from those little beginnings in Israel to this monster that is established on 7 hills of Rome? Matthew 12, Christ gives us a clue. He says in that parable, when the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry places, seeking rest, and findeth none. Then he saith, I will return into my house from whence I came out. And when he is come, he findeth it empty, swept and garnished. Then goeth he, and taketh with himself 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter in and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. Even so shall it be also unto this wicked generation. This wicked generation was the generation of John and of Christ, was as a man healed of his unclean spirit, thereafter to be repossessed of one 7 times worse. John came and preached the baptism of repentance, and we read that many came and were baptized of him, even including the leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees. So we have then this great national repentance in Israel, the casting out of the unclean spirit. But then, 3.5 years later, they were directed to accept Jesus of Nazareth. But they saw no beauty, no form of comeliness in him, that they should desire him. This old spirit of evil, 7-fold increased, entered into the house of Judah, and left nothing but for her house to be left desolate. They filled up the measure of their wickedness by crucifying the Messiah. When was her house left desolate? We all know the answer. In AD 70, when the Romans came and took away the Commonwealth of Israel. But before AD 70, and after Christ's ascension to heaven, Jerusalem and Samaria had received the word of the gospel. We know that the 12 apostles were sent to preach the gospel to Israel. But they did not want to continue faithful. Men arose speaking perverse things, teaching things contrary to the wholesome words of Jesus. We read at length in the New Testament how there were many opposed to the preaching of the gospel to the Gentiles. And they were powerless to stop that work, given that the Holy Spirit was assisting the work of the apostles. What they did do was decree that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised. Paul exhorts the Thessalonians in chapter 2, the first epistle in chapter 2, "For ye, brethren, became followers of the ecclesias of God, which in Judea are in Christ Jesus. For ye also have suffered like things of your own countrymen, even as they have of the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us. And they please not God, and are contrary to all men, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles, that they might be saved, to fill up their sins always, for the wrath is come upon them to the uttermost." And in Acts chapter 15, we read, "And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren, and said, Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had more small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. And being brought on their way by the ecclesia, they passed through Phoenicia and Samaria, declaring the conversion of the Gentiles. And they caused great joy unto all the brethren. And when they were come to Jerusalem, they were received with the ecclesia and of the apostles and elders, and they declared all things that God had done with them. But there rose up certain in the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them, and to command them to keep the law of Moses." So we see then that from the time of Zechariah, we had this building up of this apostasy, which was partly cleansed in the days of John and Christ by the preaching of the word of the gospel, but thereafter you had this the development of Judaism, which accepted the gospel in part, for the most part, but at the same time proclaimed that men had to be circumcised. This was essentially rendering the crucifixion of Christ in effect. But this apostasy was the cause of the apostles' problem. Judah, as we've already said, in AD 70 was expelled from the land of promise and carried the ephah, the measure of their wickedness, with them into the Roman Empire, where they were expelled. So this national dispersion resulted in the Judaistic apostasy leavening the whole land. And over the next 300 years, this influence, this leavening influence, infiltrated the whole of the brotherhood. Very quickly, actually, because we read in the first the chapters 2 and 3 of the Apocalypse of the letters being sent to the 7 ecclesias. So as early as 60, 70 years after Christ, the ecclesias had already left their first love. They were already harbouring Balaamites. They were already harbouring that woman Jezebel. At the time the apocalypse was delivered to John, the iron teeth power, that's the iron teeth of Daniel's fourth beast, was pagan. And they were opposed, fiercely opposed, to all non-pagans. We know of Nero, who persecuted the Christians. We read of many throughout the succeeding centuries, 2-3 succeeding centuries, who persecuted the Christians. But there was a divide between the Christians. There was the Judaistic element of Christianity, and there were those who held to the simple apostolic teaching. And the sad fact, as is in all walks of life, those who held to the apostolic teachings were becoming more and more of a minority. The divide became wider and wider over the centuries as the Jezebel faction adopted the various heathen doctrines, like those promulgated by Plato, Socrates. And you have these sort of early church leaders who are hailed as wonderful characters like Origen and so on and so forth, who essentially had lost the truth. This was Christianity for the most part in the years leading up to the 4th century. Brother Thomas in Eureka Volume 1 says, "Such had become the situation of affairs by the close of the 1st century. There were 2 women in the Roman habitable claiming to be the spouse of Christ. The one, a chaste virgin, begotten and espoused to one husband, the Christ by the word. The other, a woman, drunken and adulterous, and the mother of a progeny of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. All of them, mother and daughters, begotten of the traditions and commandments of men, making void the word of God. Between these 2 women there was rivalry and indignation. The adulteress proclaimed that she was rich and increased in goods, and had need of nothing, and invited the world in all its filthy garments to her embrace." This covetous, this rebellious, this Judaistic attitude of the most part of Christianity, Jezebel the prophetess became tricked with the paraphernalia of royalty. Not the royalty of the heavens, not the royalty of Christ's kingdom, but the royalty of 12 Caesars. The royalty which she looked for was to be enthroned in Rome. They weren't just content to dwell under the government of Rome, they wanted to be the government of Rome. In fact, they wanted to build their house in the land of China, in the land of the enemy's turf, and dwell there. The process, the culmination of this process was the first great earthquake. Apocalypse chapter 12 tells us, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pained to be delivered." So we have this woman in the Apocalypse chapter 12. Not a chaste virgin, as Paul was trying to present the body, the ecclesial body, to Christ. He wanted to present them as a chaste virgin unto Christ. This was not the woman here. This woman was pregnant with a hideous apostasy. The period of gestation is considered to be 280 days. So on the day for a year principle, we have to connect 2 dates between which is a 280-year span. The identification of the start of that 200 years is in the sin and transgression of Ananias and Sapphira, where they obviously told lies for their own personal gain. Brother Thomas says in volume 3, the original volume 3, volume 4 of the Brown edition of Eureka, he says, "This case of Ananias and Sapphira marks the commencement of the woman's symbolic pregnancy. It occurred in AD 33. This was the epoch of her impregnation. From this year of apostolic espousal to what Mr. Whiston styles the famous proclamation and edict for the universal liberty and advancement of Christianity," that was in the days of Constantine in the early 4th century. Brother Thomas says more correctly, the apostasy, by Constantine and Licinius, AD 313, which put an end to the pangs of birth, and the heaviest persecution that ever was then known was exactly 280 years. So from the days of Ananias and Sapphira, where they used the truth and lied for personal gain, to the days when a proclamation of toleration to Christianity was uttered, was 280 years. Isn't it incredible, brothers and sisters? And a stark warning to us to remember how some of these great things have such small beginnings. This first great earthquake had its beginnings in what may be considered a fairly simple sin of Ananias and Sapphira. So then the simplicity of the truth then was corrupted in the early days. The failure of the brethren and sisters at the time to heed apostolic warnings and exhortation, the failure to remove the errorists, the failure to remove Balaam, Jezebel, Nicolaitans from the ecclesias, resulted in the removal of the light stand. It resulted in the Spirit spewing these ecclesias out of his mouth. And the woman became established in the land of Shinar, in Babylon, the great city, Rome. So then a brief historic analysis around the time period of the first great earthquake, because of course no one goes down without a fight, and the pagans right up until the end were fiercely opposed to the Christians. So how then did the Christians actually obtain power? But first of all, let's just remember, before we go anywhere, Constantine, he's the great champion of Christianity. He's this wonderful guy. He's considered the champion of Christianity in the 4th century. He was a rotter. He had no qualms executing his own son. He caused the execution of or the suicide, I should say, of his own wife. He was a lovely character, all in all, and he's regarded as the champion of Christianity. And that of course is the extent of the understanding of the world. He proclaimed toleration to Christianity, but he had no time for the truth. Everyone here is aware of the Nicene Creed. Well, he didn't. There was a debate around the time of the 320s regarding the doctrine of the Trinity. Should he accept the doctrine of the Trinity, or should he accept the doctrine of the Arians, which basically said that God was one? It also stated that God couldn't have a son, so neither were actually true. But Constantine decided to choose the side of those who were most powerful and who could offer him the most support. So this is the kind of Christian that we have in Constantine. But anyway, he was the first sort of Christian emperor. How did he become the first Christian emperor? We mentioned this Apocalypse chapter 12, where we read of this woman travailing with child, the birth pangs, if you like. But these are the 10 days tribulation predicted in chapter 2. In other words, 10 years of persecution, just prior to when Christianity would gain the victory. So we need really to quickly look at the era of the 5th seal, which was the souls under the altar. It was a period of great persecution, and of course Diocletian is the one who's regarded as the instigator of all that. But Diocletian has been described as a man of vigorous mind. He was ambitious, superstitious, but he wasn't naturally cruel. For 18 years of his reign, he actually protected the Christians. And let me just say that at the time of Diocletian, we had what was called a tetrarchy. You had 2 emperors and 2 Caesars. You had Diocletian, who was in the east, he was the emperor in the east, and you had Maximian, who was the emperor of the west. And sort of as subordinate rulers, you had Caesars. The one was Galerius Maximianus, who was under Diocletian in the east, and the other one, who is the significant character, was Julius Constantius Chlorus. This was the father of Constantine, and he was the Caesar in the west. So you had those 4 characters. It'll get a little confusing with the changes and the intrigue in civil war, but never mind. So this Diocletian then protected the Christians for the first 18 years of his reign, and probably would have remained so if it hadn't been for the others in the Tetrarchy. Galerius was a fierce character who was very much opposed to Christianity. Towards the end of the 3rd century, Diocletian was supposed to have been practicing superstitious rites of divination. He became persuaded that his ill success was due to a Christian Catholic servant who had made on his forehead the sign of a cross. That's another indication of the state of Christianity at that time. He consequently ordered all Christians in his court and in his army, Christians were also in his army, that's another wonderful indication of the state of Christianity, to sacrifice to the gods. In refusing, some were put to death. But this did not commence the general persecution. He refrained from that and was very much opposed to persecuting any class in his empire. But this character Galerius visited his court in Nicomedia, which is in Bithynia, in AD 302. He spent all winter stirring up this Emperor Diocletian to obtain a sanction to, I quote, exterminate by fire, axe and torture of every kind the Catholics of the realm. But still Diocletian, despite all this, was reluctant to consent to such an edict. With the help of pagan judges and officers who Galerius sort of gathered together to add force to his arguments, Diocletian was persuaded to agree. But still he hesitated. And so, to help matters, it's believed that Galerius set fire to the palace. And on dawn, the 23rd of February, under the decree of Diocletian in AD 303, which coincided with the pagan festival of Terminalia, the Praetorian prefect with generals, tribunes and officers of the revenue set off for the Catholic Church in Nicomedia. Within only 3 hours, this grand edifice was leveled to the ground, and the general edict of persecution was published the next day. Diocletian may not necessarily have carried this out to its conclusion, but Galerius and the fellow Emperor Maximian, who were haters of Christians, set out with the intention of destroying the Christian name from the empire. Of course, we know that God was in control, and as Paul had predicted, at some point a man of sin, the son of perdition, would be established as the power of Rome. So no matter what men tried to do, they would not succeed. In AD 303, almost as if he felt the guilt of this, Diocletian resigned, and so did Maximian. So the two emperors vacated their positions, and what this did is allow Galerius and Constantius to fill the vacated positions. And so the Tetrarchy underwent a radical change. Now the interesting point to note here is that Galerius, fierce opposer of Christianity, and Constantius, who was a protector of Christians, would not obviously get along. And we have here the seeds of civil war. The Caesars were filled by another two characters then, called Maximinus Dea, who in Eureka we read as Maximin, and another man by the name of Severus. These also upheld the anti-Christian stance. So out of the four rulers, you only had one, and that was Constantius, who was pro-Christian. So what about Constantine then? Just to briefly interrupt our proceedings there. He was the son, as we've said, of Constantius, and he was born in Dacia in AD 272. That's Eastern Europe. He was 18 when his father was promoted to Caesar, so a young man. He distinguished himself very early on under Diocletian in the campaigns in Egypt. And when his father was sent to the west, and his father was sent to subdue the British who had rebelled against the Romans, Constantine remained in the east. And he rose through the ranks quite quickly because of his capabilities and the favour among the soldiers. And what this did is aroused the jealousy of Galerius, especially as he was also pro-Christian. Galerius probably no doubt felt threatened. The danger was increased by every day he stayed in Eastern Europe. So, under a pretext of visiting a part of Egypt, he actually fled and met his father Constantius in Britain, where he had protection from the ferocity of Galerius. This then is the first sort of installment of the apocalyptic prediction, where we read of the dragon striving to devour the woman and his son. Constantine escaped the clutches of the dragon and fled to Britain. His father died a year later in 306. He died in York, or Eboracum as it was called then. Now, of course, Constantius died vacating one of the positions of emperor, and the question is obviously who would fill that post. The obvious answer would have been Severus, who was the Caesar at the time, but the troops elected Constantine. And this was the spark for civil war, and from now on there would be a lot of fighting within the empire. It gets quite complicated with the position of emperors, but to give you some idea of the time period, 4 out of 6 people vying for the position of emperor were killed or committed suicide due to defeat in battle. So you had 4 of these powerful people killed and defeated, and in the end, of course, with the exception of Constantine, they were all killed. Galerius had died and opened the door to civil war. By AD 312, which is that significant date, of course, Constantine was convinced that the hostile ambition of the others necessitated the arming of his forces for defence. It ended up that he made a preemptive strike. At the same time, he proclaimed toleration to Christians. At the head of 40,000 troops, he crossed the Alps in Switzerland to face 120,000 footmen, so 3 times the number of troops, and 18,000 cavalry. They were the forces of Maxentius, who were his largest opponent at this time. He met them in the plains of Turin in northern Italy. And despite his inferior numbers, his skill and probably the morale of his troops resulted in a great victory for Constantine, defeating Maxentius' forces. Maxentius, forced to retire to Rome, proceeded to protect the city from a lengthy siege. But recognizing that it was a live or die situation, the forces met just outside the gates of Rome. By this time, Constantine had pillaged the cities of Verona and the cities of the Adige, slaying hundreds of thousands. We've all heard of the Battle of Milvian Bridge. This was what occurred just on the outskirts of Rome. Maxentius stood with Rome to his rear and the river Tiber, which runs through Rome. And Constantine, with all his horsemen, charged and dispersed the Italians instantly. The troops of Maxentius fled via the Milvian Bridge. But the bridge collapsed and resulted in the death of Maxentius and thousands of other troops who drowned with the weight of their armour, where there was nowhere to flee but the river. This was the 28th of October, 312. Thus, says Gibbon, Constantine achieved by his valour and ability the most splendid enterprise of his life. That's how the eye of the flesh sees it. The eye of faith, that's the eyes of you and I, sees it in the same light as the work of Sennacherib, in the same light as the work of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus. For we are told the wicked are God's sword. And Constantine the wicked was used to judge and avenge the blood of the slain on the wicked Maxentius and all the pagan emperors. This then was the birth of the Roman sun. Constantine annexed Italy and Africa to his dominion. So now Constantine and Licinius were the emperors over the Roman Empire. And to cut a long story short, Constantine soon showed his wonderful Christian characteristics by having Licinius executed. The dragon fought and his angels fought, we are told, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in the heaven. God had proclaimed that the pagan power of Rome was to come to an end. And here we have, instead, essentially a pagan, but one who was a protector of Christianity installed in their position. Bearing in mind, I believe Constantine was baptized something like 5 days before his death, so he was a man of conviction as well as of probity. In AD 326 he said, "When men commend my services which owe their true origin to the inspiration of heaven, do they not clearly establish the truth that God is the cause of the exploits I have performed? Assuredly they do, for it belongs to God to do whatever is best, and to man to perform the commands of God." That's a comment which reminds me of the comments of Napoleon, who said, "The hand of God guides my armies." It was so true, the hand of God did guide his armies, and he guided the armies of Constantine. Not for Constantine's virtue, not for any defense of Constantine's character, but because God had decreed that that paganism was to be overthrown. Apocalypse chapter 12 and verse 10, we read of what the Christians of the empire said in their day. Apocalypse chapter 12 and verse 10. "Now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night." It's so easy. I mean, I read this as a youngster thinking, great, now Christianity is established in the empire. Well, it was in some ways better than paganism. But anyone who knows anything of the Spanish Inquisition, who knows anything of the intrigue of the papal system, anyone who's acquainted with any of these things can struggle to say that the system that became established in Rome was anything other than wicked. This, verse 10 of chapter 12, is not the cry of the true Christian believer. This is the cry of the Laodicean believer. The believer infected with Platonism, infected with Judaism, infected with all sorts of vice and avarice, who thought that he was now rich and increased with goods and had need of nothing, but knew not that he was wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. Eusebius, who was a Christian living at the time, said, when I read this, you won't have any difficulty recognising that he wasn't a true believer. He was a professed Christian nevertheless. He said, the event when Constantine and Licinius issued this decree of toleration, he said, the event surpassed all words. Soldiers with naked swords kept watch round the palace gate. But the men of God passed through the midst of them without fear and entered the heart of the palace. And they sat down, some at the emperor's table, the rest at tables on either side of his. It looked like the very image of the kingdom of Christ, and was altogether more like a dream than a reality. And on the occasion of opening a new Catholic temple at Tyre, he said to the multitude assembled, "What so many of the Lord's saints and confessors before our time desired to see and saw not, and to hear and heard not, and behold now before our eyes. It was of us the prophet spake, when he told how the wilderness and the solitary place should be glad, and the desert rejoice and blossom as the lily. Whereas the church was widowed and desolate, her children have now to exclaim to her, Make room, enlarge thy borders, the place is too strait for us. The promise is fulfilling to her. In righteousness shalt thou be established, all thy children shall be taught of God, and great shall be the peace of thy children." What did Jesus say when death and the cross stared him in the face? My kingdom is not of this world. What were these saying? That now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God. It's the inversion of truth. And Lactantius, who was another Christian historian, said, "Let us celebrate the triumph of God with gladness. Let us commemorate his victory with praise. Let us make mention in our prayers day and night of the peace which after 10 years of persecution he has conferred on his people." True, God had avenged 200 years of pagan persecution against the servants of God and fellow brethren, but this was not a victory of truth. This was a victory of apostasy, spewed out of the mouth of the Spirit. It was a culmination of the declension from the simple teachings of the apostles. It was in actual fact the very midpoint in the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, because if we add 280 years to AD 33, we get to this proclamation, this edict of toleration in AD 313. And if we add 280 years again to that, we get to the year 604, which is when the Emperor Phocas, who's another hideous monster, proclaimed that the Pope would be the universal bishop. So what can we learn then before we close? We've seen that this earthquake changed the face of Europe forever. It has never gone back to paganism. True, Catholicism is only a slight modification of paganism, but in actual fact we don't have anyone reigning called Jupiter or Saturn. There aren't any feasts called Saturnalia or anything like that. But what good is learning this history if we don't learn anything from it? Well, we can become liable to be detached from all these things and say, that was them. That was back 1700 years ago or more. But the flesh is exactly the same as it was then. And remember the system with regards to flesh. You always have the spirit of revival followed by declension. Revival and a declension. The truth was put to death, as we will see in tomorrow's consideration, as God willing. It was put to death in 1685 along with the testifying witnesses, but was revived again in the mid-19th century. And yet very soon the spirit of truth was lost, and in 1923 was pretty much lost altogether, apart from a small number who withdrew from the apostasy and went alone. In the days of the apostles, there were teachers who turned away the hearts of the elect. And today, there are many who try to undermine the sound and proven writings of the pioneers. We hear comments like, the pioneers were only men. They weren't inspired and such like. Well, yes, they were only men. No, they weren't inspired. But they were tools raised up by God for the purpose of resurrecting the truth in the last days. And we ignore their works at our peril. What can we do ecclesially? Well, we need to remember that the truth is not ours to play with. We've been entrusted with a pearl of great price. Now, if someone were to give us something that's very, very, very valuable to them and leave us in charge of it, would we allow any individual to interfere with our guardianship of that valuable item, whether it's jewellery or whatever? Nothing should separate us from the love of Christ. Nothing should interrupt our faithful allegiance to Christ and our faithful stewardship for Him. Have we laid up our talent in a napkin because we can't be bothered, or because we're too apathetic to fight for the truth? Is it a battle we're fighting, or are we looking for a magic carpet ride? The truth, it has never been promised that the truth would be an easy ride. And again, on the subject of ecclesially, how we can remember these things, we can so often see how these little beginnings can grow into monsters. A brother who was once in Central, he's now a Berean, was telling me not long ago that he wanted to produce some book which was very, very cheap, so that anyone could afford to buy it, so it didn't have all this wonderful binding and everything. And he was told by the Christadelphian office, Central Christadelphian office, that the publication of books is the domain of the Christadelphian office. That doesn't sound perhaps like a big deal. It sounded a big deal to me because it smacked of popery. It smacked of control and anything to prevent the free publication of things. Now, he wasn't advocating publishing anything new. He was talking about Eureka, well, I think it was. But he was told that the publication rights belong to the Christadelphian office. When have we ever been given that kind of authority? And let us remember, lastly, that the papacy did not originate in the world. Did not originate in paganism, although of course, like we said, Roman Catholicism has adopted a lot from paganism, like the Trinity, which has pagan origins. But the apostasy was from the truth. The truth was where this declension started. Remember Balaam. Remember Jezebel. Brother Thomas said in the Herald in 1851, truth can stand any test. Truth is immortal and fears nothing but the lukewarmness of her friends, in whose house she is more frequently wounded than in conflict with her foes.